Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. We have a really unique collection of material to explore today, all centered around the teachings of Elder Michael Johnson.
Absolutely, and for those tuning in for the first time, or who might just need a refresher, Elder Johnson is, well, he wears many hats.
He does, he does.
He's a pastor, a master Hebraist of biblical law, really considered the world's foremost Bible preceptor.
Yeah.
And he's an expert in the language of Paleo Hebrew.
Yes, and what makes his perspective so fascinating, as we'll see today, is how he uses that expertise to unlock, I guess you could say, deeper levels of meaning within the scriptures.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to what we refer to as the law and, its connection to spiritual transformation.
For sure. And for this deep dive, you've brought together quite a collection of his work, excerpts from his book, Divine Exchange and Spiritual Transformation.
Yes.
A compilation of teachings simply titled Pasted Text, and his very insightful study guide, Understanding the Divine Exchange.
Right, we're going to try to distill, I guess, some of the really core principles
Yes.
that Elder Johnson reveals about spiritual change and its basis.
Yeah, and really get at not just the how-to of spiritual growth,
Right.
but the very foundation.
The why.
Yes, the why.
The underlying principles that drive it.
Exactly.
And again, as viewed through the expert lens of Elder Johnson.
Absolutely. So to jump right in, Elder Johnson uses this term, the foundational divine exchange, and uses John 3:16 as kind of this launching point.
Right, it's a verse I think a lot of people are familiar with.
Yes, very familiar with.
But he presents it not just as an inspirational message,
Right.
but as he says, a divine constitution.
And what's the significance of that?
Well, drawing on his deep understanding of the original languages, he really emphasizes that it's not just a comforting sentiment,
Okay.
John 3:16.
Right.
It is a foundational decree
Yes.
for how we enter Jehovah's eternal house.
I see.
The word gave, in its original context, carries a sense of a formal, legal
Oh, wow.
surrender of rights,
Okay.
a sacrificial offering with very real,
Consequences.
binding consequences within the spiritual realm.
I see. So it's not a casual act of generosity. There's real weight behind it.
It speaks to a deliberate and authoritative act.
Okay. And how does that connect to love as it's presented in that verse?
Well, he says, it's not simply an emotional affection.
Okay.
It's covenantal commitment,
Right.
which is a deliberate action taken with, full awareness of the cost. And it's expressed through what he calls the concrete mechanism of exchange,
Okay.
the giving of his only begotten son.
Right.
This kind of frames the entire relationship between us and the divine in terms of this binding agreement,
I see.
established through sacrifice.
So a much deeper understanding of John 3:16 than maybe many of us are used to.
I think so.
Now, Elder Johnson then goes on to talk about spiritual transformation
Yes.
through this idea of death and new life, and he uses the analogy of a seed in John 12:24.
It's a very vivid image he uses to great effect.
Okay.
That verse says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground, and die it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." He uses this to illustrate the spiritual principle that a seed remaining alone signifies, spiritual stagnation, a failure to reach its potential.
So it exists, but it doesn't truly live.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the pivotal point is the "if it die."
Right.
This signifies that necessary act of surrender,
Okay.
the breaking down of the outer layer to allow true abundance to emerge.
Okay. And he breaks this process down, I think, into 3 distinct stages.
Yes, he does.
What's that first stage?
The first stage is the surrender of our current self,
Okay, letting go of ego attachments.
letting go of the ego,
Yeah.
self-protection.
All those things we tend to cling to.
Yes, attachments.
He even mentions Matthew 16:25, "Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it."
Yes, and what's really striking is how he kind of brings this down to a very personal level
Okay.
of self-examination. He says, "Have you taken the time to look in the mirror and see your true self? Looking at flesh, you see the works of it also, of what you are comfortable with: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like."
So a very pointed self-assessment.
Yes, it is.
What's the second part of this transformation then?
The second, though, is embracing what he calls the hidden process.
Okay.
Just as a seed is buried in darkness, this phase represents a period of profound, but often unseen spiritual development.
Okay.
He draws upon 2 Esther 7:12,
Okay.
which speaks of narrow, sorrowful entrances leading to greater spaces.
I see.
This suggests that times of difficulty, perceived inactivity,
Yeah.
are often essential precursors to significant spiritual expansion.
So those times when it feels like nothing's happening on the surface are actually very crucial for a deeper growth.
Precisely.
I see.
He then brings in Zechariah 13:9, I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. It's like being refined by fire,
Wow.
where impurities are removed
Yeah. Okay.
to reveal the true value within. And he emphasizes that we need to trust Jehovah's work during these times,
Okay.
echoing what the Messiah taught in John 14:11, believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me. It's about faith in the process, even when we can't see the transformation happening.
That makes sense. And then what's the final stage in this threefold pattern?
The final stage is the manifestation of abundance.
Okay.
The seed sprouts and grows into this new multiplied form,
Right.
a single seed yielding much fruit. This illustrates our spiritual emergence, into our divine potential.
I see.
This expression of gifts and capacities that were always present, but needed this transformative journey
Yes.
to become active,
Okay.
as outlined in 1 Corinthians 12:4-11. But he's very clear that this isn't something we achieve through our own efforts.
Okay.
It's Jehovah's work in us.
Right. So surrendering to the process and allowing those gifts to emerge through divine empowerment.
That's it.
And this idea of death leading to abundance leads naturally to the next point, which is bringing forth much fruit.
Yes.
And the multiplication principle.
Exactly. The death of the flesh, that act of surrender we just discussed,
Yeah.
results in an abundance of spiritual fruit. It's like a visible expression
Right.
of our inner character.
Yes.
Elder Johnson refers to Matthew 7:16, do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles?
Yeah.
Our outward actions, the fruit we produce will always reflect our inner nature.
You can't expect to see good results if
If the source is flawed.
the source is flawed. Yeah.
Right.
So he emphasizes that this transformation leads to this expansion of divine attributes within us.
Yes. Things like love, joy, peace, patience.
Right. All of those.
Yeah, and what he calls a multiplication of influence.
What does he mean by that?
Our transformed lives,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
become a source of spiritual renewal for others.
Okay.
It's a ripple effect. One healthy source can lead to many others.
So it's a multiplying effect.
It is.
I see. Okay. And the sources also delve into the relationship between the seed and the heart,
Yes.
comparing Jehovah's word to a seed and the human heart to soil.
It's a powerful analogy, and Elder Johnson really explores it deeply. He says that for Jehovah's word to produce lasting fruit in us, it must follow a specific pattern.
Okay.
It has to be planted,
Right.
take root, die to its initial form as it's absorbed,
Yeah.
and then grow into new life.
I see.
And he outlines 4 stages in this process of divine implantation.
Okay. And what's the first stage?
The first stage is internalization.
Okay.
This is where the word moves from our intellectual understanding into the very core of our being. He quotes Jeremiah 31:33, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts.
Beautiful.
He also mentions Luke 2:19, where Mary treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. And Psalm 119:11, thy word have I hid in mine heart, that I might not sin against thee. It's about more than just an academic knowledge of the scriptures.
Right.
It's about them becoming ingrained in us.
Yes.
He even compares it to Ezekiel 1:1-3, the image of eating the scroll,
Okay.
of making the word a part of our very essence.
Okay. So like a spiritual digestion?
Like spiritual digestion.
Okay, I like that. And what about the second stage in this implantation?
The second stage is integration.
Okay.
This is where the literal form of the word, its outer shell,
Yes.
dissolves within the heart,
Right.
releasing its essence. And he connects this to, the concept of kenosis, the self-emptying of the believer,
Okay.
like we see in Philippians 2:7.
Okay.
He points to Paul's transformative encounter in Acts chapter 9 and his declaration in Galatians 2:20. I am crucified with salvation of Jehovah. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but salvation of Jehovah liveth in me.
Powerful examples.
Yes, powerful examples of this dissolving of the self
Right.
to make space for the divine.
So our intellectual grasp starts to become a deeper conviction.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so what's the third stage?
The third stage is transformation itself.
Okay.
In this stage, the word regenerates within us in a new form,
Okay.
actively changing both itself and our hearts. He highlights 2 Corinthians 3:18. But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. It's this ongoing process of being conformed to the divine image.
So it's not just us holding on to the Word, but the Word actively shaping us.
That's it.
Okay, and the final stage in this process.
The final stage is reproduction.
Okay.
This is where the Word, having taken root
Yeah.
and transformed us,
Yeah.
naturally extends outwards,
I see.
leading to the birthing of spiritual offspring.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
He references Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission, to go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost,
Right.
and the account in John 4:28 through 30,
Okay.
where the Samaritan woman, after her encounter with the Messiah,
Yes.
shared her testimony and led others to believe.
Okay.
The Word, having worked its transformative power in us,
Yeah.
naturally overflows and impacts those around us.
And to facilitate this process, the sources discuss the importance of cultivating the heart soil.
Yes, the analogy of the heart is soil is crucial here.
Right.
He refers to the parable of the sower in Mark 4:13 through 20 to illustrate how different conditions of our hearts influence their ability to receive the Word.
Right.
And then he delves into this need for intentional cultivation.
Okay, and what does that cultivation involve?
Well, firstly, breaking up any hardened ground.
Okay.
He references Mark 3:5, where the Messiah looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. That resistance, skepticism, acts as a barrier preventing the Word from penetrating deeply,
So it's like tilling the soil.
like tilling the soil to make it more receptive.
Yeah, what's the next step in cultivating our heart soil?
The next step is removing any competing influences,
Okay.
those worldly cares and desires that can choke out the growth of the Word, like weeds in a garden.
Right, like weeds.
He mentions Mark 3:24 and 25. If a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand.
Okay.
To illustrate the need for singular focus.
Yes, eliminating those distractions
Exactly.
that pull us away.
Yes.
And the final step.
And finally, enriching the soil with spiritual disciplines.
Okay.
Just as good soil needs nutrients,
Right.
our hearts need prayer,
Yes.
consistent meditation on the Word, engaging in worship fellowship with other believers.
Okay, so creating that environment
Yes.
for the Word to flourish.
Yes.
The discussion then moves to the death of carnal nature and birth of spiritual nature.
This is a foundational part of the whole process.
Yeah.
He explains the necessity of the death of carnal nature, what he calls the burial of sin.
Okay.
It involves shedding the old man, as described in Romans 6:6. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body's sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin.
So recognizing and relinquishing those old ego-driven desires.
Precisely.
And this paves the way for the birth of spiritual nature.
Yes, the elevation of righteousness.
Okay.
And walking in newness of life in Jehovah, as Romans 6:4 puts it. Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as salvation of Jehovah was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life.
Okay.
He says this transformation leads to what he calls multiplied influence.
What does that mean?
It's where our changed lives
Yeah.
start to impact those around us
I see. Okay.
positively.
So our old nature diminishes and the new emerges.
That's it.
Okay. Elder Johnson also talks about this idea of the divine order and spiritual mathematics.
It's a fascinating perspective he brings.
It really is.
He explains that Jehovah's order is evident in measure and number and weight,
Okay.
referencing Wisdom of Solomon 11:20. Yea, and without these might they have fallen down with one blast, being persecuted of vengeance, and scattered abroad through the breath of thy power, but that has ordered all things in measure and number and weight. He then uses the symbolism of the pyramid as a visual metaphor for this divine order.
Okay. And how does the pyramid specifically relate to that?
Well, he points to the pyramid's four sides representing the four corners of the earth,
Right.
drawing from Isaiah 11:12, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth.
Okay.
And the single unified apex, symbolizing Jehovah's oneness, drawing from Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, Jehovah our God is one Jehovah.
Okay.
He also delves into the spiritual significance of cubits,
Right.
the ancient unit of measurement,
Okay.
and their connection to heavenly harmony,
Wow.
divinely ordained proportions.
So the very structure and measurements embody divine principles.
Exactly.
That's amazing. He also brings in these biblical narratives like Joseph's storehouse,
Yes.
the burning bush.
The burning bush in Exodus 3:2, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed,
Right.
and the tabernacle.
In Exodus.
In Exodus 25:8-9, and let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it.
As examples of these spiritual patterns?
Yes, of divine order manifesting in physical forms.
It's a very interesting way to look at those familiar accounts.
Yes.
The sources then transition to the requirement of belief in living in the exchange.
Yes, he emphasizes that the benefits of this divine exchange, based on John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life,
Right.
are specifically for whosoever believeth in him. And this belief is not just an intellectual acknowledgement.
Right.
It's a deep covenantal acceptance,
Okay.
a complete placing of our trust and reliance upon him.
So it's accepting the terms of that divine constitution?
Exactly.
Okay.
He says believers are not only forgiven, but they're transferred to a new legal standing
Right.
before the divine. He references Colossians 3:3, for ye are dead, and your life is hid with salvation of Jehovah and God, in Romans 6:14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace.
Okay.
And he stresses the need for a daily recognition of this exchange.
So not just a one-time thing.
No, it's an ongoing reality.
An ongoing reality, yes. And the concept of baptism as spiritual execution is also presented in a very powerful way.
Yes, he presents baptism not as a symbol, but as a profound spiritual execution,
Okay.
the carrying out of the death sentence against our flesh.
Wow.
Romans 6:3 asks, know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into salvation of Jehovah were baptized into his death? It's a juridical event where we identify fully with the death of the Messiah,
Okay.
effectively burying our old man of sin.
So it's a much deeper concept than just a public declaration
It is.
of faith.
He explains it as the means by which the salvation of Jehovah's blood is applied
Okay.
for the remission of sins. He references Acts 2:38. Then Peter said unto them, repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of salvation of Jehovah for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. And Acts 22:16. And now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. He says there's a shift from struggling against sin to living from the reality that it's been overcome
Okay.
through this act.
Okay.
Romans 6:11 says, likewise reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through salvation of Jehovah our Lord. He also draws a connection between baptism and Noah's Ark in 1 Peter 3:20 and 21, which sometime were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was a preparing wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of salvation of Jehovah.
Wow. So it's like being carried through judgment
Yes,
into new life.
into a new life.
And the sources also describe Jehovah's Word as the structural blueprint.
Yes, he says it's the divine architecture for our spiritual growth,
Right.
designed according to Jehovah's perfect order.
Okay.
He references wisdom of Solomon 11:20 again. Yea, and without these might they have fallen down with one blast, being persecuted of vengeance, and scattered abroad through the breath of thy power, but thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight.
Yeah.
And he highlights his precept pyramid methodology, drawing from Isaiah 28:10. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little and there a little.
Okay.
It's a step-by-step approach to understanding and applying the scriptures.
Right. So it's a methodical approach
It is.
to both understanding and practice.
Yes, and he also mentions this three-dimensional nature
Okay.
of spiritual construction.
Okay.
Ephesians 3:17, 18, and 19, that salvation of Jehovah may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of salvation of Jehovah, which passeth knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God, encompassing the breadth, length, depth, and height.
So a holistic development
Yes.
of our being.
Yes.
Okay. The sources also address spiritual growth through testing.
Yes, testing is presented as purposeful examinations.
Okay.
James 1:3 and 4 states, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. It's all designed to cultivate patience and bring us to maturity.
Right. So not random trials, but
Purposeful.
purposeful with a specific intent.
Exactly.
And he also says that divine discipline is evidence of Jehovah's love.
Yes, quoting Hebrews 12:6, "For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth."
Okay, so these challenges aren't arbitrary.
No, they serve a
They
purpose,
serve a loving
a
purpose.
loving purpose in our formation.
Right, and he uses the example of Joseph.
Yes, Joseph's 7 years
Yeah,
as a powerful example of preparation through testing. And he highlights how tribulation works patience.
okay.
Patience develops experience,
Right,
and experience leads to hope,
okay.
as outlined in Romans 5:3 and 4. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations, also knowing that tribulation work with patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. He connects this back to the refining fire in Zechariah 13:9.
So it's about purification strengthening
Yes.
and ultimately shaping us.
Yes.
Okay, and sadly, the sources also address the consequences of rejection.
Yes, it's a sobering part of the
Yes,
discussion,
it is.
but a necessary one. He explains that there is a present condemnation for unbelief. John 3:18 states, "He that believeth on him is not condemned. But he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God."
Right.
And he talks about the danger of willful sin after knowing the truth, referencing Hebrews 10:26 and 27.
Right.
The perversion of Jehovah's grace into a license for ungodliness, as warned in Jude verse 4.
Okay.
And the ultimate destination of the lake of fire
Right.
for those who reject the divine offer, as mentioned in Revelation 20:15.
Right. So a very serious look at what it means to turn away
It is.
from the divine exchange.
He also highlights the insufficiency of religious works
Okay.
performed without genuine relationship.
Right.
Citing Matthew 7:21, 22, and 23, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in my name have cast out devils, and in my name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity."
Okay.
The spiritual token of Lot's wife looking back.
In Luke.
In Luke 17:32 and Genesis 19:26.
Yeah.
The point of no return is mentioned in Hebrews 6:4-6. The reality of outer darkness described in Matthew 25:30. The finality of the second death in Revelation 21:8.
Okay.
The urgent need for a response.
Yes.
In 2 Corinthians 6:2, "For he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I suffered thee. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." The eternal fixity of our destiny.
Okay.
Illustrated in Luke 16:26. "And beside all this between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence."
Wow.
And the warning against presumption.
Okay.
Found in Proverbs 27:1, "Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth," in James 4:13 and 14. "Go to now ye that say, Today or tomorrow we'll go into such a city and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain, whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away."
So a very comprehensive look at the consequences
It is.
of rejecting this path.
Yes.
But thankfully, the sources also offer this message of hope in the eternal reward for overcomers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He describes overcomers as being made pillars in Jehovah's eternal temple.
Wow.
Referencing Revelation 3:12, "Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out, and I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name."
Okay.
The principle of losing our temporal lives to gain an eternal one.
Right.
Matthew 10:39, "He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." Having our names written in the book of life.
Revelation.
Revelation 21:27. "And there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination, or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life." The transformation from glory to glory.
Right.
In 2 Corinthians 3:18. "But we all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image, from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord." A glorified body.
Right.
In Philippians 3:21, "Who shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working, whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself," becoming a new creation.
2 Corinthians.
2 Corinthians 5:17, "Therefore, if any man be in salvation of Jehovah, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new." And partaking in the divine nature.
Wow.
As described in 2 Peter 1:4, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust.
So a really incredible picture of glory and transformation
It is.
that awaits those who embrace this exchange.
He also emphasizes the need for daily surrender.
Right.
As encouraged in Romans 12:1 and 2, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God.
Right.
And he offers this warning against claiming a relationship without undergoing transformation.
Right.
Referencing Matthew 16:24, then said, Salvation of Jehovah unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
Okay.
He talks about the covenantal nature of love,
Okay.
demonstrated through obedience.
Okay.
John 14:15, if ye love me, keep my commandments. The reality of the final judgment.
Yes.
2 Corinthians 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of salvation of Jehovah, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he has done, whether it be good or bad.
Okay.
The eternal distinction between the sheep and the goats.
Matthew.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. We always like to bring you the good stuff, and today we are really excited to dig in again to the teachings of Elder Michael Johnson.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
Pastor Master Hebraeus of Biblical Law. I mean, the titles just keep going. World's leading Bible preceptor, and just, expert in Paleo Hebrew, and really just the comprehension of that language. I mean, I'm always blown away by it.
Oh, yeah, his depth of knowledge is incredible.
Yeah, so we're going to be focusing today on some powerful insights, I think, related to, spiritual transformation, and really looking at some meticulously examined sources that are rooted in his teachings.
Exactly. And the source material that we have today goes into the core concepts of spiritual growth, the significance of Scripture, and how important the choices that we face are through Elder Johnson's unique perspective.
Right. And so our mission today is really to kind of extract those most crucial nuggets, from this wealth of material, and provide you with a clear and engaging understanding of these concepts.
Yeah.
So we're going to be exploring some really interesting themes, like John 3:16, and seeing it not just as some inspirational verse, but as Elder Johnson terms it, this kind of divine constitution.
Right.
And then we're going to be looking at spiritual growth, likened to a seed, the role of testing, and then the ultimate consequences of accepting or rejecting these principles. So get ready for some aha moments, folks, as we kind of connect these ideas.
What's so fascinating is how Elder Johnson's teachings, in these sources that we're looking at, they really elevate John 3:16 beyond just, a simple statement about God's love.
Right.
He really kind of positions it as this divine constitution, outlining a legal and spiritual exchange. And it's really important to remember, as a master Hebraeus, that Elder Johnson brings just these deep linguistic insights,
Oh, absolutely.
that really inform his understanding.
Right. So the text really emphasizes this legal and sacrificial nature of God giving his only begotten Son. And so it's not just, kind of a casual act. It's a formal sacrificial offering with these binding consequences, and all driven by this deep covenantal love, this so loved.
Right.
And, for you, the listener, I think this helps us understand the weight and the intention behind this act.
Absolutely. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, it really becomes the foundation for entering God's eternal presence. It's through belief in salvation of Jehovah that this entrance is made possible. And, the source material really highlights this as kind of this spiritual exchange of the highest order.
Yeah, a legal transaction.
A legal transaction in the heavenly realm.
Wow, and so it ties into what's called this law of exchange,
Right.
this fundamental idea of life for a life, which is presented, as this main premise for understanding Jehovah's covenant. So why is this law of exchange so central, and are there any potential, misunderstandings of this principle?
Well, the law of exchange is central because it reflects a core principle that we see throughout Scripture. Something must be given up to gain something greater. And in this case, it's salvation of Jehovah, giving his Son to offer salvation. And any misunderstanding, I think, would come from thinking that this is simply a transaction without the deep love and the covenant that motivates it.
Right, it's not just a quid pro quo.
Exactly.
It's coming from this place of deep abiding love.
Right.
And from that legal foundation, we then move to the spiritual exchange itself, the death of the flesh to birth the spirit. And, this is this core tenet that runs through these teachings.
Absolutely. And
Okay, so we've got this divine exchange laid out.
right.
Now, the teachings delve into this powerful metaphor in John 12:24, this principle of a seed needing to die to bring forth much fruit. And it's presented not just as an analogy, but as this universal spiritual principle.
Right.
So how can this seed metaphor, help us understand our own spiritual growth?
What's so fascinating is how the text unpacks this phrase, abideth alone. It simplifies spiritual stagnation. Think of a seed that never breaks open. It remains isolated, unable to connect and multiply.
Right. This abideth alone is described as this spiritual isolation, so the lack of relationship and multiplication. And then, it also represents this limitation, untapped potential locked within.
Exactly.
Like, even though that seed has the potential for, an entire plant, it can't express it.
Right.
And then thirdly, it's this stagnation. The seed remains dormant, never developing or producing. And this kind of parallels the spiritual stagnation that can occur when we resist transformative truth, clinging to our current understanding instead of embracing what the Word of Jehovah offers.
Right.
So this abideth alone state, while possessing life, is ultimately unfulfilled. It falls short of that abundant life that we're meant for. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The transformation that comes if it dies.
Right.
It's not annihilation,
No.
but it's a transformation, an expanded being.
Exactly. And the text breaks this down into this threefold pattern of transformation. First, the surrender of the current self. Just like that seed breaks its shell, we need to relinquish our present form, our ego-driven desires, our attachments to our current state.
Right. The sources even reference Galatians 5:19-21, listing, those works of the flesh, and Matthew 16:25 about losing your life to find it. It's about letting go of that limited self so that our true divine nature can emerge. So how does this surrender of the self manifest in everyday life?
Well, the surrender can be seen in those moments when we choose humility over pride, forgiveness, over resentment service, over self-interest. It's that daily process of aligning our will with Jehovah's will.
Right. It's that continual surrendering.
Exactly.
And then secondly, embracing the hidden process. So the seed's journey through darkness, it mirrors our spiritual transformation, a period of unseen but profound development. It's likened to those narrow, sorrowful entrances
Right.
of 2 Esdras 7:12 that lead to these greater spaces.
It's a time of apparent dormancy, but underneath there's intense spiritual activity happening, a reorganization, a restructuring, and the text connects this to Zechariah 13:9, that refining through fire.
And this hidden phase, it isn't without divine presence. The teachings point to John 14:11 about this divine indwelling, so it's Jehovah's Spirit working within us during this time.
That's right.
And then thirdly, manifestation of abundance. So, that seed emerges in this new form, no longer limited, but expansive, multiplying.
Right.
And this illustrates our spiritual emergence, into divine nature, the expression of gifts and capacities that were always there, but needed that transformation to be expressed.
Right.
So this bringing forth much fruit, as the teachings describe it, is this visible manifestation of inner character and spiritual life. It's the multiplication principle, the singular becoming plural, the limited becoming abundant.
The sources refer to Matthew 7:16, you shall know them by their fruits, highlighting that our outer life reflects our inner reality. This fruit represents far more than just produce.
Right.
It's the evidence of a transformed heart.
Right. And this transformation leads to this expansion of capacity. Like a vessel enlarged to hold more, the transformed soul can express spiritual attributes with greater depth and power.
Right.
The teachings even touch on John 14:12, about doing greater works and then increased effectiveness, so divine energy flows through those surrendered vessels with less resistance.
Right.
Things that once felt like a struggle yield greater results with less personal strain.
That's right.
So we've seen how, this principle of transformation works through the image of a seed. Now let's delve into where this seed, the Word, takes root, the heart.
Okay.
So the teachings delve deeper into the heart as this soil where the seed is planted, referencing Luke 8:11. And for the word to bear fruit, it must go through a specific process within the heart.
Okay, so what are the 4 stages of this divine implantation?
So first we have internalization. This is where the word moves from the intellect to the very core of our being. It's likened to Mary pondering things in her heart, as mentioned in Luke 2:19. And the teachings contrast this with the 4 types of soil in the parable of the sower in Matthew 13,
Right.
where, only the good soil allows the seed to truly take root.
Right.
And the sources also reference Jeremiah 31:33 about writing the law in our hearts. So what does that mean to write the law in our hearts?
Writing the law in our hearts means that those principles aren't just external rules, but they're deeply ingrained in our character and our motivations, guiding our actions from within.
Right, so it's not just hearing or reading, but letting it sink deep down.
Exactly.
What comes next?
The second stage is integration. This is where the word's literal form, its outer shell, kind of dissolves in the heart's depths, releasing its essence. And it's described as kind of a self-emptying, referencing Philippians 2:7. And Paul's conversion in Acts 9 is given as an example, of this shattering of the old identity to allow salvation of Jehovah to become life.
It's like that seed breaking down to its life can merge with the soil.
Right.
What's the third stage?
Transformation, this is that mutual shaping of the word and the heart, leading to the manifestation of the divine nature. The sources point to Romans 12:2 about being transformed by renewing the mind, and John 15:5 about apart from salvation of Jehovah, we can do nothing.
Right.
It's that synergistic relationship where both are changed in the process.
So the word isn't just sitting there, it's actively changing us.
Right.
And the final stage?
Reproduction, this is where the word now transformed within us multiplies beyond the individual producing spiritual offspring. Matthew 28:19 about making disciples, and John 4:28-30 about the Samaritan woman sharing her encounter are given as examples. It's the word bearing fruit that then produces more fruit.
Now, the teachings also address the challenges to this process, right? Like the condition of the heart soil.
Absolutely.
Right.
The challenge of hardened heart soil is mentioned, referencing Mark 3:5, where Jesus was grieved by the hardness of hearts, and this prevents the word from penetrating.
Right. And then there's the issue of shallow rocky ground, as in Mark 3:3-8, where the seed sprouts quickly but lacks root and withers under pressure.
Right. This represents a lack of depth to sustain growth through challenges.
Right.
But then there's the potential of properly prepared, fertile heart soil.
Right.
As in Mark 3:8, yielding 30, 60, and 100-fold. And the sources connect this back to Matthew 18:24 about the initial vast investment, suggesting we all start with this immense potential.
Right. We all have that potential within us.
That's right.
And how do we cultivate this fertile heart soil? The teachings mention spiritual disciplines, don't they?
Yes. The role of spiritual disciplines like prayer, meditation, worship, and community, is highlighted as being crucial in cultivating that fruitfulness, creating the optimal conditions for the word to thrive.
Now, the teachings also introduce this concept of a pyramid of spiritual growth. Okay,
Yes.
let's unpack this.
Okay.
For you, the listener, it's this visual metaphor for this whole transformation process, moving from earthly multiplicity to divine unity.
Exactly. Okay. The base of the pyramid represents our carnal nature, which the teachings connect to the first 5 books of the law. It's that wide foundation of earthly attachments and desires.
Okay, and as we ascend the slopes, what does that signify?
The ascending slopes symbolize this progressive refinement of consciousness as we die to those lower impulses and rise towards spiritual awareness. Each level up is a new stage of surrender and transformation.
And the very top, the apex.
The apex represents that singular point of divine unity and perfection, where all that multiplicity converges into oneness with Jehovah. It's the journey from fragmentation to wholeness.
And this pyramid structure, it mirrors the seed's journey in those 4 phases we talked about, right?
Precisely sacred burial, which is that conscious surrender of our carnal nature.
Right.
Then divine development, that hidden period of inner transformation, spiritual coming to the light, the manifestation of that new life. And finally, multiplied influence, where that transformed life then becomes a source of transformation for others.
Now, the teachings really emphasize this law of exchange again. In the context of this pyramid increase comes through decrease abundance, through surrender life, through death. It circles back to Matthew 16:25 and even Isaiah 55:8.
What's fascinating here is how the law of exchange is presented as this foundational principle throughout Scripture, reaching its ultimate expression in the substitutionary atonement of salvation of Jehovah.
Right.
The ram in the thicket in Genesis 22:13 is given as this powerful example, a token of substitution.
And this law of exchange, it forms the stable foundation, the base of this precept pyramid structure right now, for those unfamiliar with the term. A precept in this context is a rule or principle prescribing a particular course of action or conduct.
Absolutely. It's the bedrock upon which all higher spiritual truths are built, and the teachings present this divine exchange as this precise spiritual equation. Divine life, salvation of Jehovah, minus man's sin equals eternal life.
Wow, it's almost like a spiritual calculus,
Exactly.
with the cross as that critical differentiation point.
Exactly. And John 3:16 is seen as establishing those fundamental variables in this divine equation, and what activates this equation in our lives, obedience to Jehovah's word.
Right.
You know.
Putting those principles into practice.
Right.
And the teachings even extend this sacred mathematics to redemption. referencing Deuteronomy 3:11 about Og's breadstead and the prayer of Manasseh 9. It's this idea of precise spiritual measurements and calculations in Jehovah's plan.
Right.
It's fascinating now. A crucial aspect of this spiritual growth, as these teachings outline, is testing. And it's not something to be avoided, but something with a vital purpose.
Right. The teachings draw on James 1:3-4, highlighting that testing produces patience, perseverance, proven character, and ultimately spiritual completion.
Right, so it's working something out in us.
Exactly. And divine discipline or chastening, is presented not as punishment, but as evidence of love.
Right.
Referencing Hebrews 12:6, it's formative, it's designed for our development.
Right, and the story of Joseph's 7 years of plenty and famine in Genesis 41 is brought up as this spiritual token of preparation through these cycles of abundance and scarcity. So how might these cycle of abundance and scarcity prepare us for the future?
Well, these cycles teach us resilience, gratitude, and dependence on Jehovah. They refine our character and prepare us to handle both prosperity and adversity with faith and wisdom.
Right, and again, this process is framed within this spiritual calculus of growth, so differentiation, the removal of impurity and integration, the accumulation of righteousness.
Right.
And the spiritual equation presented is baptism plus faith equals spiritual transformation.
That's right.
Okay. And the metaphor of the refiner's fire from Zechariah 13:9 is used again to illustrate this purification process. And the testing of Abraham in Genesis 22:1 is held up as this prime example of faith being proven through trial.
Right. And the progressive nature of testing is also emphasized, drawing from 2 Corinthians 4:17, where light affection works towards a greater glory, and the wilderness experience in Deuteronomy 8:2 is seen as preparation for our inheritance.
Right, it's all preparation.
Exactly.
Now, the teachings don't shy away from the serious consequences of rejecting these principles, do they?
No, they present a very clear picture. There's present condemnation for those who do not believe in salvation of Jehovah based on John 3:18.
And the danger of willful sin after receiving knowledge is highlighted referencing Hebrews 10:26-27.
Also, the misuse of grace leading to condemnation, as mentioned in Jude 14, and the ultimate consequence of persistent rejection is eternal separation in the lake of fire, according to Revelation 20:15.
Right, and the teachings also point out the insufficiency of religious works without a genuine relationship, drawing from Matthew 7:21-23.
Right. Lot's wife in Luke 17:32 and Genesis 19:26 serves as this spiritual token of the danger of looking back,
Right.
of divided loyalty. And this rejection leads to structural failure in that spiritual pyramid we discussed earlier.
Right, that foundation is compromised.
Right, and the concept of a point of no return is also mentioned, referencing Hebrews 6:4-6, and the consequences extend to outer darkness, as in Matthew 25:30.
Right.
And ultimately, the second death, as described in Revelation 21:8. The teachings really emphasize the urgency of response, referencing 2 Corinthians 6:2, and the eternal fixity of destiny, as seen in Luke 16:26.
And finally, there's this warning against presumption, not taking future opportunities for granted, drawing from Proverbs 27:1 and James 4:13-14.
So this deep dive into Elder Michael Johnson's teachings really does reveal this meticulously ordered path to spiritual transformation, all grounded in that divine exchange offered through salvation of Jehovah.
We've taken a really close look at the foundational principle of life for a life, the essential step of burying the old self through baptism, the crucial role of Jehovah's Word as our guide, and that refining process of testing that leads to maturity.
Understanding these layers and the spiritual mathematics behind them as these teachings present them offers a profound framework for your own journey. And as we've explored, the choice to embrace this transformation has eternal implications.
Consider the invitation presented in these teachings to move beyond mere belief to a complete surrender and alignment with divine principles. What stands out to you as the most significant aspect of this divine exchange?
This has been just a glimpse into the depth of these teachings, and we encourage you to further explore these concepts and consider how they apply to your own pursuit of knowledge and spiritual growth.
That's it for this week's Deep Dive. We'll see you next